Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. Elijah Meeks has a fascinating background for a tech startup co founder. He started with a graduate degree in the humanities, moved into software development within academia, got heavily into data visualization and worked at both Netflix and Apple, and now is the co founder and chief innovation officer of Noteable. With that unique background, it's perhaps unsurprising that he has a different perspective on a lot of things than many engineers I've interviewed. In this conversation, we talked about the ways that has shaped his approach, how most disagreements are more about context than content, and how learning to see power and the different ways it is exercised in an organization can be key to success. Please enjoy this interview with Elijah Meeks. Elijah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So, to get us started, do you want to share a little bit about your background and how you came to care about these things that I've been calling human skills?
So I am the chief innovation officer at a small startup called Noteable. We're a notebook company. We make a product that's a computational notebook. That's like your audience might be familiar with Jupyter notebooks. These are data science tools for writing code, but also writing text and embedding charts and graphs and figures. We've been doing that for about 3 years now. Before that, I was at Apple and I was at Netflix as what's known as a data visualization engineer. And then before that, I worked professionally as a research developer at Stanford, supporting professors in the humanities, so professors of literature, classics, history, to develop research projects, what they call the digital humanities. So we did, for instance, a tool called Orbis, geospatial transportation network model of the Roman Empire. You can go there, orbis.stanford.edu. It's a Google Maps for the Roman Empire, which is really fun. And then before that, I was a graduate student in the humanities. I was studying history and philosophy and stuff like that. So I didn't come to tech in the sort of traditional path where you're in the hard sciences or you're studying software engineering, especially.
That might be an interesting place to start. So, where have you found that coming from a non traditional background in that way has influenced your approach to tech?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I think that you can't get at sort of a graduate level in the humanities without being exposed to postmodernism. This idea that, as I think it was John Berger who said that you can never tell a story again as if it was the only perspective on that story, that everything has multiple perspectives, that people have different truths. And a lot of the stuff that I think in tech people are being exposed to under the auspices of sensitivity or diversity and things like that, you know, in the humanities, you were exposed to this a long time ago as part of your understanding of the world of human beings. I remember when I studied Wikipedia for a while and did some research on that, and I was at one of these Wikimania conferences. This was years and years ago at Harvard, and I was being interviewed by a reporter from NPR, and they said, "Well, isn't Wikipedia garbage? Because you go to the George W. Bush page on Wikipedia, and it's a mess of people arguing about George W. Bush, who was the president at the time." And I pointed out to them that no, it's because we still haven't figured out in this sort of encyclopedic way who George W. Bush is. We're still wrestling with that, right, at that time, and we're even still wrestling it today. And so that awareness that when I go and speak to somebody in a professional industry setting, whether that person is an engineer, a product manager, somebody in people ops, is always there. I'm always aware that when they disagree with me or they disagree with others, that disagreement is not necessarily an argument to be resolved with one person being right and another person being wrong, but rather a communication layer that probably needs a lot of translation. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's right about everything that they feel, of course, But oftentimes, what we see as fundamental disagreements on content are actually fundamental misunderstandings of context. And I've found that to be extremely valuable in how I've kind of navigated my professional career.
I love the way that you express that. The disagreements on content are often fundamental disagreements about context. Can you share a little bit more what you mean by that distinction or how you're drawing those lines?
Sure, sure. So we tend to think, especially in tech, we tend to have this idea of the rock star engineer and another engineer, and one of them is simply smarter or at least more experienced with the problem that they're trying to solve. And one of them will be right and one of them will be wrong. And that does happen. You know, we deal with technology. Technology is a very constrained space. And so it is possible for me to know more than you about, say, a library like D3. I'm an expert in D3, data visualization library in JavaScript. But oftentimes what happens is that we actually don't fundamentally agree on what the problem is. We don't necessarily agree on the definition of the terms that we're using. It might be that that for you, I'll use a technical term that to me covers this problem, and to you refers to a different problem. I don't want to go too specific or even too wide, because like you can go forever talking about language. And I know that your audience is practical, and in industry you want to be practical. But we do have to recognize that people show up at work not as like a fresh face out of the computer. They show up just like these large language models do, with a huge amount of implicit context, that they were trained on a certain set of material, and as a result, their responses are going to be influenced by it. You know, most of the time, you run into in situations, especially like I did, where I acted, I jumped around a lot in organizations, especially at Netflix, and worked with a lot of different teams. And you find that people are, you know, concerned with whether or not you're helping them or you're helping yourself. And you have to understand whether or not you're wasting their time. And by, you know, to do that, you have to expend effort to understand the language that they use to describe what they do, to understand their domain. And then you have to sort of prove it to them. You have to build trust with them, but you also have to kind of spend that trust. You have to say, hey, now that you trust me, I'm going to make a bet that I understand you well enough to push you to do this other thing. And those aren't always the case. So the context, what I'm trying to say in that regard is that context isn't static. It's not like, Kevin, I entered this conversation with you. I know that you were at these startups. I know that you had this background in physics. So therefore, I'm going to talk to you this way. It's also that as I'm talking to you right now, you know, 30 minutes into this conversation, you'll have this updated context with me, being aware of how I communicate, what I do, and that will change what we're able to talk about 30 minutes from now.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. There's a couple different pieces we might dig into there. I'm going to bring us to one, which is you talked about not agreeing on what the problem is. And one of the things I've seen that happens certainly in an engineering career is as you move up in seniority, more and more of your work comes from being solution oriented to being problem oriented.
Right.
How do we define the right problems? How do we come to agreement about what those problems are? What tactics have you found helpful in doing that problem definition work?
So, you know, for me, especially given my background, it all has to be strongly collaborative. Like the reason why we see that in senior engineering positions is because senior engineering positions are leadership positions. It's not so much about you writing all the code and being such a genius that you write all this perfect code. It's about you understanding the team or teams that are touching the code or the process or the workflow or the design, and making all of them more effective by providing them with that critical context. And so when you're doing that initial sort of fact finding, as you just get involved with the project, you have to understand where the technical constraints are, who is invested in certain technical constraints, what their working styles are, whether or not there are larger forces at play. We know this, especially at certain tech companies. If you don't have your own library, you're not going to get promoted to a staff or principal engineer. So you have to have a solid open source library that shows off that you're a smart person. And oftentimes that's presented as kind of a corruption, right? Like, oh, this person's only creating this, it's a knockoff of this other library because they have to, because she wants to get promoted, right? But we have to accept that regardless of whether or not we necessarily agree with those forces at play, those forces are constraints that we're working with, and we are constraint-based problem solvers. That's what a human being is, that's what our brain is built for. And so just acknowledging that, acknowledging what and how much people are invested, what they're best at, what they want to thrive doing, and then being able to communicate in the most empathetic and charitable way possible across the team is key to me about being sort of a senior contributor. And let me state very bluntly, you, I'm sure, we have all worked on teams where somebody is not a high performer, is not very invested in the project, perhaps has a working style that is very at odds with other people's working styles. A true leader in that situation still finds ways to make that person effective, finds ways to mitigate their effect on the rest of the team, and actually helps everyone build toward including that person, a successful professional trajectory, and not just a successful conclusion of that project. We're all on our own different trajectories. And if I can make you, Kevin, more successful at what you're doing in your long-term career, and not just have a successful podcast here, I'm going to be more effective for you, and you therefore are going to value me more and value my contribution later on at times when you think that that's going to help. And that is what leadership is. That's what building success is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So dialing in on that particular challenging situation you mentioned. Okay, I have someone who's not interfacing well with the rest of the team, but I want them to be successful and I want the team to be successful. Are there concrete tactics that you have found to be effective there, or is it so situational that there's not any generalizable lesson?
I think in every situation, short of somebody who is just a confirmed malcontent who is toxic, and also keep in mind that even somebody in that situation, you can find ways to frame that, right? If somebody is just the worst, and then you sort of dig into it and find out they're the worst because their personal life is horrible right now, then you can help everybody by saying, hey, you have to be empathetic toward this person. We're all human beings. And that's a great way to build camaraderie and to make a more effective team. But there are times when somebody's completely just tuned out, and there's not much you can do in those cases, right? Other than, like you say, just sort of shield. But in most cases, it's that someone is more interested in experimenting with new technologies rather than maybe achieving the practical goals on time. And maybe they're from a unit where they're not going to be evaluated by whether or not this project hits its milestones. And so it's doubly difficult. But in those cases, you can find what they're most excited about. And as a senior technical leader, you should be able to figure out, okay, well, they're interested in this technology. They want to rewrite this entire framework. We can't do that because we'll miss our milestone. But maybe there's some aspect of it that you can just give them control over, that they can really geek out on and feel empowered by you. And maybe you see in what they're doing there a pattern that the rest of the team might get excited about. I'm going to give Kevin the ability to rewrite this notification API because I think he's got a great idea for it. And I know that it's not on our roadmap, but I think it's going to ultimately in the long term be of value. If I'm on a team that hears that, I don't think, oh, Kevin's getting special treatment, I think, oh, that's exciting. Maybe there's some way that I can also,
Mm-hmm.
help in that way. So it's about contextualizing people's trajectories. It's about contextualizing um, a person's actions in a way that the rest of the team doesn't take the least charitable interpretation of it, which is actually a logical fallacy. As someone who studied logic, like, you're actually supposed to, in an argument, assume the most charitable interpretation of someone's argument, and if you don't, then you're actually in the wrong. So
Mm-hmm.
once again, humanities providing me with all the tools necessary to succeed.
Well, and that's the opposite of our fundamental attribution bias, right? Where we assume that, oh, they're doing this because they're a terrible person, not because it's about the
Absolutely.
situation or what have you. I like that because it weaves together some of the threads you've been talking about, right? So you highlighted this difficult individual. Probably the challenge is that they want to solve a different problem than the problem you
Exactly.
want to solve.
Exactly.
And so then you are figuring out how to translate between the problem they want to solve or problems that they want to solve and what's going to be effective for your team.
And I think a core perspective that people need to keep in mind is that relationships are about trust. And we spend a lot of time building trust and letting people know we're reliable, letting those people know that we value, understand, and rely on them, or can rely on them. What we often don't hear about is spending trust. You have to actually actively think about, okay, now that I've established my trust with Kevin, now that Kevin has worked with me long enough that he trusts me, I'm going to push Kevin out on the limb, right? I'm going to say,
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, I want you to make a bet with me about something you don't agree with. And we're going to go do that thing. And if it fails, then I lose trust. It's true. That's the bet. That's why it's a bet. But if it succeeds, you and I are going to get to another, a higher level of collaborative possibilities. And so we often think about building trust, but we also have to think about spending trust and pushing people to try things they don't want to do and they fundamentally disagree with for some reason or another, because you think it's valuable, and because if it's successful, then you can have more cohesive and more dynamic relationships within your teams.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting because you're not just spending it, you're kind of investing it, right?
It's
You
true.
might
It's true.
lose that
That's right.
trust
That's right.
if your investment fails.
That's right.
But if your investment succeeds, it actually generates more trust on top of it. Of, oh, I wasn't sure about this thing, but it worked out.
No, that's definitely the better term for it. You're right, because it is investing, because sometimes your investments fail, as all of our portfolios, as all of our startup experiences
Has shown
can
us,
tell us.
yes, absolutely. So coming back to another thread in what you said, you said something I liked, which is you said we are constraint based problem solvers.
Yep.
How do you think about constraints in terms of defining them, uh, finding them, working around them? Like, what is your mental model for those constraints?
I'm not a very systematic person. Like I'm systems oriented. I have a lot of sort of interest in structures. Like, I wouldn't be in this field. Typically, we are, like, we have to understand sort of structures and systems. But when it comes to how I deal with my uh, interpersonal relationships professionally, I very much I don't like keep track of. I don't keep notes on people's personalities, or think about sort of ways to put them into different categories. I don't agree much with all of these sort of personality tests and things like that. I find those to be quite limited. And so the way that I approach it is in this much more squishy, to be honest, but postmodern way. That I take the signals that I get. I try to understand more about a person's uh, uh, professional situation, where they're at in their career, and I find that that's the most valuable way to sort of inflect how I interact with folks to um, find out what they're passionate about, how they want to build and be successful. And I try to let them know in a very sort of transparent way that while we're working together on something, that I know that this isn't a forever thing. That like even at a startup, the startup, I love Noteable. I love the people who are working here. I will tell them, you're going to work somewhere else, and working on project X is going to be great for your resume because you're going to be touching the technology that's important. Like we're dealing with AI a bunch right now. I've said this over and over again. You're going to want to work on this because this is exciting, because at the next company, someone's going to say, hey, have you touched large language models in production? You'll be able to say yes. And I think I'm going a little bit far afield from your original prompt, Kevin. But I guess the important thing is to understand individuals as agents in a system, that they have their own goals, that they have their own points that they're at, that they might not be at the same point you are professionally. They might not have the same value system that you have, but that it's incumbent on you to understand it, because presumably as we're talking about this, you're probably going to be thinking about it more. If you're listening to a podcast like this, you're going to be thinking about it more probably than that person. And you have to deal with it as best you can.
There's something that you said there that I think is interesting, which is, you highlighted that any particular project or job is relatively transient. And in our industry, I think in some ways that's even more so, right?
Yeah.
Like all the software that I worked on early in my career is no longer running. It's gone.
Yeah.
So those things are very transient. But a career spans 20, 40, if you're lucky, maybe even 60 years, or unlucky. I don't know which one that would be if it goes to 60 years, but it spans a lifetime.
That's right.
And the relationships you build span a lifetime. So I'd love to actually dive in a little bit more on how you think about the role of any particular project or job in that bigger picture, and how you kind of zoom in and out.
Well, it is incredible, isn't it, Kevin, that what you said is absolutely true. It's inarguable. And yet, when you look at engineers, they spend most of their time focused on learning technical skills and not on learning human skills. Even though all of the technical skills they're going to learn are going to be out of date and or in requiring continuous refresh, whereas your human skills actually are the more you invest in them, the longer you can use them. And as we were talking about, as you advance in roles, the more important they become. So that's, to me, that's pretty remarkable to me. For me, all of these things, being in data visualization makes my experience probably a bit different from other folks' experiences, because data visualization is fundamentally about design. Design is about communication. Design is about sort of structurally understanding how we're communicating and how we're working together. And I've had to take on roles of designer and product manager and things like that in working with teams of technical people and domain experts, whether those domain experts are professors of the classics or they're PMs, in charge of streaming content or whatever. And so for me, that sort of social layer has always been there. And, I'm pretty happy with my technical skills, but I'm very clear with folks when I work with them to say, hey, I'm not the greatest coder. And I've always said that. I'm not the greatest coder. Now I can build anything in D3. You want some kind of information display and you want it done in D3? I can do that. I've worked with React long enough to know most of the ins and outs of React, and I can do decent work there. But I'm not the person who's going to optimize it for a website that gets 10 million visits a day, right? And I'm comfortable saying that. I'm comfortable saying that even though I know in certain audiences it actually damages my credibility. Because that's a short-term amount of damage. And in the long term, my transparency and my ability to self-evaluate is actually going to improve my credibility.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it's an interesting point of, I think when we're getting started, a lot of times we think, oh, if I say I don't understand that, or I ask a question about this thing that maybe I think I should know about, or these other things, it's going to damage me. And to your point, there may be a short term cost, but the long
Yeah.
term benefit of being clear
Yeah.
about where you are, what you understand, what you don't, and we're all in this over the long haul. So trajectory is far more important than where you are right now.
That's right. There is no more unreliable a collaborator on a team than the person who quietly nods during a discussion and leaves not understanding it. Like those people, like on high performing teams and high performing organizations, those people are spotted and avoided at all costs. The person who is not comfortable enough, and I'm not saying in every situation, because we know there are dynamics where you're in an unsafe position. I've been there too. You're in an unsafe position to express your some weakness, whether it's technical or otherwise. But if you're working with people and those people don't know whether or not you understand something, and they have to figure it out on their own, you're adding cognitive load. Not only do they have to manage all their own challenges for understanding the problem, they also have to do this Kremlinology with you to understand whether or not you actually get it, or if you don't, or if there's a disagreement in how you both comprehend something.
So I like that you mentioned safety, because I think that's a key piece here.
Yep.
And we can come at it from two angles. I'm actually going to start from the coming into a new organization standpoint. Yeah. How do you figure out, is this a safe place to be that vulnerable or not?
I mean, there's if I had the 2-sentence answer to that, I'd be one of these motivational speakers. So I don't have the perfect answer for that. But you have to take that sort of honeymoon period for what it is. And that honeymoon period is everybody kind of trying to, what is it when the protocols are talking to each other, like when the modem is screeching at each other? I'm showing my age here, right? Everybody's trying to calibrate what you mean in the ways that you're producing and the ways that you're communicating. You're trying to figure that out too. And it pays to be more conservative and more, I'm a very sort of, I'm not the most reserved person, even in those situations, but it pays to be reserved. But you can't, you have to recognize that the cold clinical employee who only says what they know and is a solid performer is only going to go so far, right? Like this idea that you're going to just be judged by your merits in this very sort of, there's a computer and it's measuring all of your traits and you're going to be promoted if you pass all of these traits, is incredibly naive. Like, I mean it, it's, and when people, the growth that's necessary to get out of that is hard to reveal the value of to folks, because they think that it's kind of a corrupt system at that point. They'll speak to like, oh, well, this person's just good at talking to people, right? Everybody loves so-and-so. They don't write great code, but everybody loves that person. That's why they're being promoted. You hear it often applied to managers, right? Oh, well, this person's a manager because they can't do the work. And those are very pernicious expressions of a value system. And the reality is that, we are well past the day when one person, lone genius can do this stuff on their own. And almost everything we do is collaborative, or almost everything worth doing is collaborative. And if you can't work with others, if you can't recognize that different people have different personalities and styles, then it's going to be very challenging for you to be successful at the higher levels of even the most technical of roles.
Yeah. So in some ways, what you're describing is this little dance in the honeymoon period, where there's benefit to being a little more reserved, but you also kind of
Yeah,
want to test and like
yeah,
put yourself out a little bit and
yeah,
say like, if I ask a few more questions, is that safe
yeah,
to do here?
yeah.
And if not, you're in the honeymoon period and they'll forgive you, and
That's right.
you can kind of get that sense.
No, Kevin, that's spectacular. That's a perfect practical example. Like I've literally done that. I'm sure everyone has, where in those first meetings, you maybe ask too many questions, and somebody kind of rolls their eye, and you get that. You get, okay, well, I've gotten to the point where this is too many questions, or you make too many jokes, or you make too few jokes, or something. I've always made too many jokes. That's been something that I've struggled with my entire career. You recognize that, and you calibrate, and you will find, the thing to do. And here's the most challenging thing, especially for someone who I imagine listening to a podcast like this, is that a lot of folks come into this with the wrong expectation. Because there's going to be a lot of folks listening to this that say, okay, tell me exactly what kind of person I should be to succeed. And the answer is actually be yourself. Because in the long run, the more you're yourself and the more you're honest about it, the more you're going to find out that, yes, sometimes you don't fit in a certain organizational structure, you don't fit on a certain team, but you're going to be able to optimize toward where you're going to be the most fulfilled and productive. And your teammates are going to think you're the most fulfilled and productive. And that doesn't mean like, show up at work with like your favorite, like weird t-shirt or something like that. Because, we're not, you can't be everything that you are everywhere that you are. That's just not feasible. But it does mean don't watch Charisma on Command and start tapping everybody on the shoulder or looking into their eyes just because you think it's going to, quote, make you a more effective communicator or more charismatic. Do these things if you feel like that makes sense to you, that works for you. When I was talking about like the cold clinical person, like I know a lot of cold clinical human beings that maybe they're more acerbic, that maybe they're, they have different ways of approaching things than I do, but they're themselves, and they're not, and in that way, they can still communicate, they can still command respect, they can still operate within a team. I don't think that there are any human beings, because human beings are fundamentally social creatures. I don't think there's any of us that are just, can't stand other human beings. That doesn't make sense from the perspective of the species. And it's just, there's different ways that we can't stand other human beings, and we have to find out which ways.
We may not be able to stand some particular human beings.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think there is this really interesting balance that you're talking about here. And, I've been talking with a lot of folks about kind of crafting the position that you want to be in, right? Like, sure, you go into a job that probably has a job description, but that does not have to create those constraints don't have to stay fixed. You are continuously creating the position you want to be in.
Absolutely.
But as you do that, and as you try to figure out, how do I be myself in this situation, there are externalities that you've got to navigate. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about was this concept of hierarchies and power structures. And you've been able to see that from a few different situations in academia, where there's a very different approach to how work is organized than big tech, and now at a startup. So do you want to share a little bit about how you think about hierarchy and power structures?
Absolutely. So I wasn't just in academia, I was at Stanford, which can get very hierarchical very quick. You're a full professor at Stanford. You have a certain expectation that the people around you are there to help you be productive. And that expectation can come out in very sort of explicit language. I don't mean cursing, but I mean very sort of like these expectations are part of the job. And for a lot of folks, that can be very hard because, we all in our personal lives have had times when we think that the person in charge shouldn't be in charge and they have too much power over us. To me, it isn't one thing or another. It's just, it just is. It's a constraint that you operate under. You accept it, you understand it, and you either work there or you don't. And I don't mean to be blasé about that, but it's one of many styles. In contrast, Netflix, especially Netflix in the era that I was at Netflix, was very flat. It was very flat and very exciting, and you had work that you expected to do, and you had opportunities, like you're saying, Kevin, to change your role, right? To really change your role. But to go back and contrast that with at Stanford, because of that strong hierarchical nature, if I happen to work with an extremely well-respected scholar and get that scholar story in a magazine because of the work we did, then that person is motivated to support me, to allow me to further redefine my role, which is literally what happened with it. At Netflix, it was more about less hierarchical power and more implied power. The kind of what we think of as kind of a healthier kind of power, where people want to work with you because they know you're a high performer. You want to work with them because you know you're a high performer. You both know it's an impactful project. And even though there are definitely units and there are managers and things like that, you have these mechanisms available to you to work cross-functionally and accomplish really sort of amazing things. The challenge, I think, is for when people grow up in the latter environment, when they are promoted to a position where they actually have hierarchical power. And what I've seen there is that those folks don't have the best grasp of how hierarchical power works. And I've gotten very, very theoretical here, so let me get very sort of practical in my language. If you've spent years motivating people to support you through interpersonal relationships because you cannot order them to support you, then you might think once you get into a position where you can order people to do things, that you wouldn't want to do that because it's clumsy and mean, and instead you want to develop a personal relationship with all of your reports, and you want them to work for you because they want to work for you. When in reality, when you're talking to them and you have power over them, it is not the same peer relationship where you're negotiating peer trust. Instead, you're talking to someone who reports to you, who you control their salary, who you control whether or not they get promoted. And even though they might respond to you in a language because they have figured it out, of I'm your buddy and we're figuring this out together, they might not mean that. They might be trying to navigate what for them is a very unequal position. There's another problem too, which is that, and I was one of these people at Stanford, sometimes I like to get ordered around. Sometimes I like for somebody to come in the room, kick down the door and say, we need this, you need to do this by then. Like, we need this. The order came from the top and this is what's happening. Now, I'm not saying all the time. I think it's clear from my personality that's probably not like my number one way of working with people. But there are people who enjoy that. And there are times in their lives when they enjoy that, right? When you just you go home and everything's a mess. Like, we built a house and for years it just felt like everything was a mess. And I just wanted somebody to just tell me what to do. That would have been much better. Instead of figuring out how to run a startup, right, with no rules. So when you don't do that, you're actually not honoring someone's working style. You might have a team then in what I've described here, like the horror situation is you have a team, let's say 10 people report to you, Kevin. 5 of them are pretending to be your friends, because clearly that's what you want us to do, is pretend to be your friends. And the other 5 are sitting there saying, this person doesn't inspire me, this person doesn't have any vision, they have no authority, because they're not telling you, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and now get to work, guys, let's go. That can be a blind spot for folks, because to go back to, I think a common theme here is, there's only one truth, and the truth is that there are no hierarchical relationships. We're all equal human beings. And I fundamentally agree with that. But in a professional setting, that's just not the case. That's not what we agree to in our sort of social contract when we join an organization. And if you don't own up to that, if you don't acknowledge that, then you're operating sort of you're not operating with reality.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. There's 2 pieces there that if I could tease it apart. So one is there are different ways of organizing work, and people have different preferences for those. And so just like making that explicit, right? There is not one true way to organize work. There are multiple ways, and we can agree together about what way we are going to approach or how we are going to organize. But then beyond that, there's this sort of power dynamic of role, of when you are in a role that has power, and power might be defined as I can set your salary, or I do hiring and firing decisions, or what have you.
Right.
There's weight and baggage that comes along with that. And so you have to be, and it's not even, any type of power gives this, right? It might be
That's right.
You are the most experienced senior engineer. You don't have anyone reporting to you, but if you poo-poo a project, people are going to look askance at it, and that's power.
That's right.
And so
That's right.
As you start to have any form of power accumulate, whether it's by position, formal role, or by experience, or what have you, you have to start to be conscious of, like, what does that do in terms of how the things that you say or the way that you approach things are perceived?
No, absolutely. And for me, this has been a learning process. Like I'm presenting it probably like I learned all this in grad school studying ancient Chinese history, and now, you fools, you should have, I don't know, read the Master Gong or something, right? Like one of these like 3,000-year-old Chinese texts. I had learned this on the ground, and it was tough. It was tough because I thought, that people who lorded it over you, that they had power, were unhealthy. I thought that I was surprised that moment in my career when, just like you said, I come in and say, oh, well, that sounds like nonsense. And I've said that for years. And then suddenly I said it, and people thought, oh, well, this person is destroying this other person's credibility because they're an expert. And I didn't even realize, right? I thought I was just, somebody sitting in the back making a little too open with their opinion, like I'd been for years. And that was very challenging because I didn't want some of that, right? It's more fun. It seems healthier and it seems more enjoyable to just have a peer relationship with everyone. It seems like some kind of ideal work environment where we only get along if we get along. I'm not trying to manipulate you. You're not trying to manipulate me. I'm not modifying who I am because, I'm not going to be this slick used car salesman, right? And then what you find out is actually by doing that, you're taking on a particular stance. That stance is actually rather aggressive. It's incredibly intimidating if you get away with it, and it's incredibly frustrating if you don't get away with it to the people around you. And it's the biggest challenge in tech because tech was built on this kind of cartoon ideal that, unlike everywhere else in the world where people get away with stuff with their human trickery, in tech, you're only evaluated by the cold clinical lens of science, and are you a great engineer, or are you a bad engineer? Solder this circuit for me, right? Like if you can solder this circuit properly, you're a good engineer, and otherwise you're a bad engineer. And so it permeates the way that people evaluate and express themselves in a way that doesn't happen in other industries.
So you mentioned that you kind of had to learn this as you were going. Do you have any recommendations for folks who are trying to learn to see power? Because it, especially coming from a technical background, like
Mm-hmm.
it's not always the easiest to see how
Yeah,
this stuff flows.
yeah. Well, I think that one thing is to start to see, like, split it into those two dynamics we were talking about earlier. The person who has authority versus the person who is great at building consensus, right? Walk into a room and see the person who gives orders that people enjoy hearing, right? Like the classic Steve Jobs thing. The person who, for some reason, can come into a room and say, "This is garbage, do it this way." And everybody smiles and they're so enthusiastic and they're like, "I can't wait to work until 1 o'clock in the morning." Okay? See those people, but also see the people who enter into a room and say, "Well, there was an old Saturday Night Live skit, right? The unfrozen caveman lawyer. I don't know much about this or that, but it sounds to me like you're saying this, and it sounds to me like you're saying that." And notice that there are some people who can do this, and then suddenly people are agreeing with them. And when the meeting is over, the decision very much tended toward what it seemed like not benefited them, but matched up with the way that they seemed to be positioned. I'm trying to avoid like these judgmental things because I don't think of any, like, it's all business. Like, it's all made up stuff anyway. It's not like there's like good or bad, like when it comes to what does Acme Chemical Company decide to do with its coding platform, with its CI/CD implementation this year. Who cares, right? There's somebody who has one idea about it. There's another person who has another idea. A third person might have a third idea, and what you end up doing is going to most resemble one of those people's ideas. And look for the people who didn't tell somebody what to do, but it seems like they're the most trusted advisor for many people who know what they're doing. And when they're in those group situations, they happen to speak. They don't speak much. They happen to speak. And when they do, people happen to agree with them. And that helps, because that's two kinds of power, right? And then what you're going to find is you're going to probably find that one of those more suits you, and then challenge yourself to understand the other one and understand the applicability and value of the other one, even if you find that you prefer one of those two. Because to get to, to go to the authority thing, we have to remember authority. When we talk about authority, that's not just me, telling my reports what to do. Authority is also the route through which managing up happens. So, like,
Say more.
everybody's dealing with that. Yeah.
Say more about that. Authority is the route through which managing up happens.
Right. You can't manage up in a peer relationship. When I talk about having authority, well, I'm sure everybody listening, and even myself, right, tends to think the Steve Jobs who tells people what to do and they do it. Even Steve Jobs had a bunch of people who had no technical authority over him, who understood, his goals and his style of working with people, and were able to help him to understand how his approach could be inflected to resemble something that they more wanted, and managed to help Steve Jobs be better in the brightest, the best sense of managing up, right? You're trying to make everybody better. You're not trying to subvert someone's authority. I'm trying to help you, Kevin. You don't quite understand me and what I want to do. I'm going to actually be more effective if you do. So I'm going to help you to understand why what I want to do, which isn't what you wanted us to do, is still better for all of us. And so navigating, managing up can only happen within an environment where you have explicit authority.
I think the other key and interesting piece here that we've talked about is that these are skills. They are learnable skills.
That's
They're
right.
not, and so, if you, I think you highlighted, sometimes someone who doesn't have these skills yet is like looking, saying, why is that person getting listened to
That's right.
all the time?
That's right.
What are they doing that I'm not? And there's a whole swath of different things that go into that. But
Yep.
I'm curious if there are particular skills you have found useful to practice in this domain that you might recommend to folks.
So public speaking, I would suggest to everyone public speaking, like in any chance you get, any meetup you get, anything like that. And when you speak publicly, instead of focusing on like a feature list, I want to get through these points and I want to relay these points to my audience. Instead, try to pull people in. Instead of the goal of your talk being a broadcast goal to get as much information across as possible to an audience in as short a time as possible, which is a very sort of classic engineer perspective on public speaking. Instead, make a goal for yourself to say, I want to get the most questions. I want to get the most engagement from the most number of people in this audience. I want to get engagement from people, and this isn't in a public speaking role, it's in other roles too. I want to get engagement from people who are not like me in a team meeting. Try to get it, if you're a data engineer, try to get engagement from the design person, right? Try to get engagement from the data scientist. Try to get engagement from someone else. Because, like you've said earlier, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. The answer really is that you, in a room, are one person with your own context and trajectory, and this other person is a completely different, very special flower. And the only way you can learn to deal with a broad swath of people in that way is to try to to get engagement, like I said. I'm a little caught up because like engagement nowadays also means like negative, like downvotes and slagging on YouTube and things like that. So not that kind of engagement, positive engagement with people whose roles and responsibilities don't resemble yours. People whose communication styles don't resemble yours. I'm actually loath to tell people to sort of like take courses and study things and do all of that stuff, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and all of that. The folks who really get deep into that hit an upper limit on their growth. Because what happens to them is they've studied it and it becomes something that they're, quote, experts in. And then they start to work with people and they say things like, oh, well, you're not, communicating in the correct way. You're not approaching this personality
type. It moves
type
from curiosity to judgment.
Right. And you're like, no, I'm communicating. I'm a human being. I'm communicating. That's how this situation works. And if you can do that, if you can just walk into a situation, own, like once you have to have certain prerequisites. Once you have reached a level in your career where you feel pretty solid about like where you're at, and you can walk into a situation and be that person and be very open about it and be very comfortable dealing with the facts that sometimes you're not going to be perfect for whatever the answer to that question is. You're going to find that people want to work with you, want to support you, want to learn from you, and they're going to want to make you successful because you're making them successful.
So I just realized we're coming close to the end of our hour, and we've covered a lot of ground. It feels like it's gone really fast. There's a lot we could dig into, but in the 5 minutes that we have left, is there anything we didn't cover that you particularly want to make sure that we touch on?
Oh, sure. How about generative AI? Let's talk about that for a second. So Noteable, our company, released a plugin for ChatGPT that allows you to make interactive data-driven documents using just a prompt. Well, guess how prompts work? Guess what prompt engineering is? It's about communicating. It's about providing context. It's about understanding your audience. It's about being everything that we've talked about here with this natural language interface. And so when you look at what's coming, even I said that there weren't any, maybe there are. Maybe you could be a lone person, like never having to deal with human beings. You're still going to have to deal with this AI. And that AI, until Elon Musk puts the electrodes in our brains and it goes directly from there, you're going to have to use words. You're going to have to communicate the fundamental principles of communication, which are going to make you an effective leader and an effective collaborator with your teammates and your clients and your stakeholders. Actually, it turns out, make you really good at using the at least current interface into as close as we can get to AI. And we've seen it. We've seen it with I just cannot believe. I'll tell you, Kevin, when we were building this plugin and our chief architect said, we should do this. And I thought, oh, well, this is exciting. We should do this. You're right. I thought, wow, it's going to be fun. A few people are going to use this. But it's not going to be huge because it's not going to make you, it's not going to say, show me a picture of a California quail in a top hat like Midjourney. Like that's got broad appeal, right? Like make a data-driven document. That's not broad appeal. Oh my God, the number of people who are using this. The number of people who want to make data-driven documents. And it turns out what they've been waiting for is being able to just do it via communication instead of writing code. I'm shocked. So yeah, learn these skills. Even if you hate human beings, learn these skills because they work even on computers.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.